For more than 2 decades, one unwritten agreement shaped the relationship between Russia's political leadership and its business elite. Build your fortune. Stay out of politics. Support the system when asked. Your wealth, your companies, and your future would remain protected. But what if that agreement is beginning to break down? And what if the greatest threat to Russia's long-term stability is no longer coming from the battlefield, but from the growing uncertainty inside its own economic system? Modern wars are rarely decided by tanks alone. They are sustained by factories, financial markets, energy production, transportation networks, and above all, confidence. Governments can mobilize soldiers. They can redirect industries. They can borrow enormous sums of money. But every wartime economy ultimately depends on one invisible resource: trust. Investors must believe tomorrow is worth investing in. Business leaders must believe their assets are secure. Financial institutions must believe today's sacrifices will eventually produce tomorrow's stability. Once that confidence begins to weaken, even the largest military machine starts encountering problems that cannot be solved with additional weapons. Over the past several years, Russia's economy has undergone one of the largest wartime transformations in its modern history. International sanctions reshaped trade routes. Energy exports were redirected toward new markets. Domestic industries were reorganized to prioritize military production. At the same time, the government expanded its role across strategic sectors. Increasing state influence over industries considered essential for national security. Officials describe these measures as necessary adaptations to extraordinary geopolitical circumstances. Critics, however, argue that they also reflect the growing pressure of sustaining a prolonged conflict while managing an increasingly complex economy. One of the most closely watched developments has been the expanding role of the Russian state in private business. Through court rulings, ownership disputes, and legal reviews of historical privatization agreements, a number of major companies have shifted away from private ownership and towards state control or government-approved management. The legal justifications vary from case to case, but together they point toward a broader trend: the state is exercising far greater influence over assets it considers strategically important. Whether viewed as national security policy or economic centralization, the practical result is the same. Business leaders now operate in an environment where long-term certainty has become increasingly difficult to predict. For decades, Russia's wealthy industrial class understood the boundaries of the system. Politics remained the responsibility of the Kremlin, while business focused on generating revenue, maintaining employment, and supporting national priorities when requested. That relationship produced a degree of predictability. Today, however, predictability itself has become a valuable commodity. If ownership rules can change during periods of national emergency, corporate decision-making inevitably changes as well. Executives become more cautious. Investment horizons become shorter. Capital preservation begins replacing long-term expansion as the primary objective. This dynamic becomes especially important during wartime. Every modern military campaign consumes enormous financial resources. Equipment must be manufactured. Infrastructure must be repaired. Logistics networks require constant maintenance. Personnel costs continue regardless of battlefield conditions. Unlike short military operations, extended conflicts place continuous demands on government budgets. As those demands increase, policymakers face increasingly difficult trade-offs between military spending, economic growth, and financial stability. Energy remains central to this equation. Oil and natural gas have long served as major contributors to Russian government revenue. While export volumes have adapted to changing global markets, fluctuations in energy prices, transportation costs, infrastructure disruptions, and international restrictions all influence fiscal performance. Analysts continue debating the long-term resilience of Russia's energy sector, but there is broad agreement on one point: sustaining wartime expenditures becomes significantly more difficult when energy income experiences prolonged pressure. Meanwhile, another challenge has emerged far from the front lines. Throughout modern warfare, critical infrastructure increasingly becomes part of the battlefield itself. Oil refineries, storage facilities, transportation hubs, electrical grids, and industrial production centers now carry strategic importance equal to many traditional military targets. Repeated disruptions to these systems do not necessarily produce immediate military defeat, but they can gradually reduce economic efficiency, increase operating costs, and complicate logistics across an entire country. In this sense, modern conflict often resembles an industrial competition as much as a military one. Economic pressure also extends into financial policy. Governments facing elevated inflation frequently rely on higher interest rates to stabilize prices and protect their currency. While such measures may strengthen monetary stability, they also increase borrowing costs for businesses, discourage private investment, and slow broader economic activity. During peacetime, these effects can often be managed gradually. During wartime, however, policymakers face a far more delicate balancing act. The same interest rates needed to contain inflation may simultaneously reduce investment in the industries expected to sustain long-term economic growth. This creates a strategic dilemma. Military spending stimulates demand in certain sectors while placing enormous pressure on public finances. Higher borrowing costs stabilize inflation but reduce private investment. Greater state involvement increases centralized control but may also reduce business confidence. Each individual policy can be justified independently. Yet together they create a complex economic feedback loop in which solving one problem often generates another. Perhaps this explains why economists increasingly describe modern conflicts not simply as military confrontations, but as endurance competitions between entire national systems. Victory depends not only on battlefield performance but also on industrial output, fiscal flexibility, technological adaptation, political stability, and the willingness of economic institutions to continue functioning under extraordinary pressure. The question, therefore, is no longer simply whether Russia can finance today's military requirements. The deeper question is whether the economic relationships that supported the country for decades can continue functioning under the demands of an extended wartime economy. Because history repeatedly shows that governments rarely face their greatest challenges at the moment resources begin running low. Those challenges emerge when uncertainty begins changing how people make decisions. And once enough individuals begin planning for a different future, the structure holding an entire system together can begin changing long before the outside world notices. The strategic consequences extend well beyond government budgets. Every modern economy runs on expectations about the future. Companies invest because they believe tomorrow's market will justify today's expense. Banks lend because they expect borrowers to remain solvent. Entrepreneurs expand because they believe property rights and commercial rules will remain reasonably predictable. When uncertainty becomes a permanent feature rather than a temporary disruption, those calculations begin to change. Businesses postpone expansion. Investors preserve liquidity instead of taking risks. Capital becomes more cautious, even if it never openly leaves the system. That shift is difficult to measure, but history suggests it often matters more than any single economic statistic. Nations rarely experience sudden economic collapse without warning. More often, they undergo a gradual erosion of confidence that slowly reduces productivity, innovation, and investment. Growth becomes increasingly dependent on government spending rather than private initiative, while the private sector waits for greater clarity that never fully arrives. Russia's wartime economy illustrates this dilemma. Military production has expanded dramatically in several sectors, helping maintain industrial output despite international pressure. Defense manufacturers, logistics companies, and parts of the heavy industrial base continue operating at high capacity. From a purely industrial perspective, this demonstrates a remarkable ability to adapt under difficult circumstances. Yet military production alone cannot sustain every part of a national economy indefinitely. Consumer industries, technology development, housing, transportation, commercial lending, and small businesses all compete for the same pool of labor, financing, and industrial capacity. As more national resources flow toward defense priorities, policymakers face increasingly difficult choices about where future investment should be directed. Those decisions become even more complicated if economic growth slows while official demands continue rising. This is why economists often describe prolonged wars as contests of resource allocation rather than simple measures of military strength. Every additional missile, armored vehicle, or air defense battery represents labor, steel, electronics, fuel, transportation, and financing that cannot be used elsewhere. Modern governments can sustain these trade-offs for extended periods, but they cannot eliminate them entirely. Another factor shaping the long-term outlook is infrastructure. Throughout this conflict, both sides have increasingly targeted industrial facilities, transportation corridors, logistics hubs, and energy networks. These assets are valuable not because they produce immediate battlefield victories, but because they determine how efficiently an economy can support military operations over time. Repairing damaged infrastructure requires skilled labor, specialized equipment, imported components, and significant financial resources, even when repairs are completed successfully. Repeated disruptions can gradually reduce overall efficiency and increase operating costs throughout the economy. Financial markets watch these developments carefully because they influence long-term expectations rather than short-term headlines. Investors ask different questions than military analysts. They are less interested in who controls a particular village and more interested in whether industrial production remains stable, whether inflation can be contained, whether businesses continue investing, and whether government finances remain sustainable over the coming years. Those questions rarely produce dramatic television coverage, yet they often shape geopolitical outcomes far more profoundly than individual military engagements. This broader perspective also helps explain why governments increasingly view economic resilience as a national security asset. Industrial capacity, technological innovation, transportation systems, banking stability, and energy infrastructure are no longer separate from defense planning. They have become part of defense planning itself. Countries capable of maintaining production, attracting investment, adapting supply chains, and preserving financial confidence possess strategic advantages that may prove decisive in prolonged competition. For Russia, maintaining that balance will remain one of the defining challenges of the years ahead. The government must continue funding defense requirements while preserving macroeconomic stability. It must encourage industrial production while controlling inflation. It must maintain investor confidence while expanding the state's role in strategically important sectors. None of these objectives are mutually exclusive, but each makes the others more difficult. History offers useful perspective here. Great powers rarely experience decisive turning points because of a single military defeat. More often, prolonged strategic competition gradually increases pressure across multiple systems simultaneously. Fiscal strain interacts with industrial production. Industrial production affects investment. Investment influences technological development. Technology shapes military capability. Military requirements then generate additional fiscal demands, completing a cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to manage over time. This does not mean that any particular outcome is inevitable. States have repeatedly demonstrated remarkable resilience during periods of sustained pressure. Governments adapt policies. Industries reorganize. New trade relationships emerge. Technological innovation creates unexpected efficiencies. External conditions change. Energy markets recover. Financial pressures ease. Predicting collapse simply because challenges exist has repeatedly proven to be a poor guide to history. At the same time, ignoring accumulating structural pressures can be equally misleading. Strategic competition is rarely decided by dramatic moments alone. It is often determined by which system adapts more effectively to long-term constraints while preserving the confidence of the institutions and individuals that keep the economy functioning. Ultimately, this story is about far more than one country or one conflict. It reflects a broader transformation in how modern power operates. 21st century competition is increasingly fought through factories instead of fortresses, logistics instead of geography, capital flows instead of territorial expansion, and industrial resilience instead of purely military strength. The battlefield still matters, but it no longer tells the entire story. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. When people think about modern warfare, they usually picture soldiers, aircraft, and missiles. Increasingly, however, the decisive questions are being asked inside boardrooms, central banks, energy facilities, manufacturing plants, and transportation networks. Those are the places where national endurance is ultimately measured. Whether Russia successfully navigates these pressures remains an open question, just as the broader geopolitical landscape continues to evolve. What is clear is that the outcome will depend on far more than events along the front line. It will depend on whether economic institutions continue functioning effectively, whether industrial capacity can keep adapting, whether financial confidence remains intact, and whether the balance between state control and private initiative can continue supporting a wartime economy over the long term. Because in the end, history repeatedly reminds us of one simple truth. Wars are not won only by those who possess the most firepower. They are won by those who can sustain that power the longest. And in modern strategic competition, endurance is measured not only in armies, but in factories, infrastructure, finance, technology, and above all, confidence. When those foundations remain strong, nations can withstand extraordinary pressure. When they begin to weaken, even the world's most powerful states discover that the greatest battles are often fought far away from the front lines.